Welcome again, everyone, and thank you for joining us for this APF at-home fireside chat. We are delighted to welcome Dr. Jeffrey Nevid today, a recipient of the newly redesigned APF Gold Medal for Impact in Psychology. I'm Dr. Doug Haldeman. I'm a member of the American Psychological Foundation Board of Trustees, and I am your host for today. As you all surely know, APF is the premier private grant-making foundation in psychology. APF provides over $1 million annually in grants awards, with increases coming every year thanks to the generosity of our donors. Our goal is to support psychologists and students whose research uses psychology to address major societal issues and to improve people's lives. APF is unique in that it receives the overwhelming majority of its funding, around 95% of it, from individuals like those of you joining us today. We cannot express our gratitude enough to you for your generous investment in APF and the important research that we continue to fund. As we proceed today, if you have any questions for Dr. Nevid, please feel free to enter them in the Q&A feature found at the bottom of your Zoom screen. We will do our best to address all of your questions in the conclusion of today's program. And it is now my great pleasure to introduce our guest today for this fireside chat, Dr. Jeffrey Nevid. Jeffrey Nevid is a professor of psychology at St. John's University. He was awarded a PhD in clinical psychology from the State University of New York at Albany and was an NIMH postdoctoral fellow in mental health evaluation research at Northwestern University. Dr. Nevid holds a diplomate in clinical psychology, ABEP, is a fellow of the American Psychological Association, and has served as associate editor of the Journal of Consulting and Clinical Psychology, and as consulting editor for the journals Health Psychology, Teaching of Psychology, and Psychology and Marketing. Dr. Nevid has amassed more than 200 research publications and professional presentations, and is the author or co-author of a number of textbooks and other books in the field. Dr. Nevid is a highly respected speaker and researcher and was the longest serving doctoral program director in clinical psychology in the US. Welcome, Dr. Nevid. Jeff, your research and receipt of the Brewer Award are primarily rooted in the research and teaching of teaching and learning. Can you start by sharing with us a bit about what initially drew you to this area of research and why you chose to focus on the psychology of learning?
Well, first of all, I'd like to thank you, Doug, for moderating this event, and of course, APF for honoring me with this award, and for setting up this event. To answer your question, when I think about what drew me to focus on the psychology of learning, I think back to the fact that I was fortunate to have completed a postdoctoral fellowship in evaluation research at Northwestern University. So I very quickly learned about the importance of applying research methods to better understand the learning process and how we can help our students succeed in the classroom. You know, as a postdoc, I studied with the foundational figure in the development of concepts of experimental validity, Donald T. Campbell. It was Campbell who coined the distinctions between different types of validity, internal, external, construct validity, and so on. And he understood the importance of conducting true experiments in laboratory settings to strengthen internal validity of experimental studies. But he also recognized the need to develop methods that allow us to study behavior in natural settings. You know, we live and work in a world outside the laboratory where we may not be able to conduct true experiments that require random assignment of participants to conditions. This is especially true in educational settings. So I needed to adapt my methods to work in vivo classroom settings, settings in which each of us struggle to teach to the best of our ability each and every day. So I've had to find some creative ways to evaluate the learning benefits of pedagogical techniques in actual classroom settings. If I can give you one example. A few years back, one of my publishers came to me and asked if I would be interested in using their electronic learning system, or ELS, with my intro psych textbook. These systems were first coming onto the scene. And I told them I'd be willing to try it out, but only if they understood that I would need an opportunity to evaluate the learning benefits. So I performed a study that involved a quasi-experiment, a term that Campbell coined. And I tested two separate classes in intro psych, one in which the ELS, the electronic learning system, was required, and the other in which it was optional, but students were encouraged to use it. The instructor, yours truly, was the same. The textbook was the same. The exams were the same. Everything else the same. But what I found was that the class in which I used the required ELS system, I should say ILS system, integrated learning system, used the required ILS system, significantly outperformed the other class on the average by about 6%. So I was able to thankfully demonstrate a learning benefit associated with using this electronic learning tool. You know, we also discovered something very interesting and revealing about how students use the ILS. The students in the ILS optional class used it inconsistently. They may have used it the first week when they're encouraged to do so, and then all of a sudden, woo, their usage dropped off the chart essentially. But the students in the ILS required class continued to use it consistently. And I think that speaks to us about the need to integrate these tools within our syllabus, not just distribute them in the hopes that students will pick up on them. You know, I think about the classic movie that I love, and many I'm sure do, Field of Dreams, which I'm sure you remember. But I think when it comes to education, I don't believe that if you just build it, they will come. The ILS may be rich in learning tools, but students aren't likely to use it unless it's required. Now, I don't think you have to assign all of it, and I don't in my classes. I like to do is assign the quizzes, but give extra credit to students for completing some of the other parts. So this is an example, I think, of how we can look at these pedagogical tools and approach them from a research standpoint that we can actually demonstrate whether or not they are producing any kind of learning benefit.
You know, as we referenced earlier, you have published hundreds of articles and authored or co-authored a number of books, including textbooks, and these are still being used today, of course. Could you say a little bit about the unique approach you have to writing a psychology textbook based on the research you've done on effective learning?
Thank you, Doug, for that question. Such an important question. You know, when I got involved in writing textbooks all those many years ago, don't ask me how many, I think dinosaurs might still have been walking the earth. The pedagogy that was built into textbooks then and to a certain extent now, based in part on some solid learning principles, but mostly they were driven by marketing decisions. If a leading textbook in a given field used, say, a modular approach, then the publisher said, let's go modular to compete with the competition. But having trained with Campbell, I felt I needed to bring a different approach in developing pedagogical materials like textbooks, one grounded in a concept that I've called evidence-based pedagogy. For example, when I began writing at the intro psych level, I thought a modular approach would make sense. It appealed to me because it would present information in more digestible units. But I felt that I needed to test out whether or not there was a learning benefit associated with that way of structuring the material. And in fact, we did a study and we found the modular format was preferred by students. And although it wasn't a slam dunk, it's not as if it produced such exceptionally better results than a traditional narrative approach. But students who told us they preferred the module approach actually wound up doing better with that approach than they did with the other approach. So there is, I found that there was some benefit. I've continued to use module approach in teaching at the introductory level. Another example, if I might just have a moment.
Sure.
I also wanted to see if there was some benefit of highlighting key concepts, not just key terms. A technique I called concept signaling. Let me explain. And I think some of our best ideas come from us students. And I remember in this case, a student approached me some years back before I sat down to write an intro psych textbook. And I was using another book, a good book, yes, commonly used. And the student came to me and said, Dr. Nevid, I have a question. What is learning the key terms in psychology? Is that the most important thing in learning psychology? Knowing the key terms. I don't know if you have gotten that question. I had not gotten that before, but it was a very intriguing question. And I turned it around to the student. I said, well, key terms is certainly important to know. That's the working vocabulary in the field. But why would you think that learning key terms is the most important thing that you need to learn in psychology? And she had a very logical answer, very logical. She said, well, you know, as you leaf through the book, all you see are these bolded key terms, as if those are the most important, those are the most important things to learn. Not necessarily the key concepts or the theories that integrate those concepts, but the key terms themselves. So in effect, inadvertently, I think as textbook authors, we've been signaling students all these many years that across the disciplines that learning the vocabulary words, as important as maybe, is the most important thing about learning the subject matter. So I went out and I did a study. I wanted to see if highlighting key terms, key concepts, not just key terms, would have a learning benefit. So this is an actual laboratory-based study. And what we did using a randomized counterbalanced design in which students read 2 text passages. If you can follow me with this. They read 2 text passages, one with concept signaling, in which the key concepts, along with the key terms, were highlighted in the margins of the text. And the other more traditional format in which only key terms were highlighted. And then I gave them a content acquisition quiz at the end. And we found that students did better on the questions on the quiz that mapped onto the signaled content when we use concept signaling than when they read the same material word for word without the key concepts highlighted in the margins, about 6 or 7% on the average. Interestingly, that's why we do research. We don't really know until we go out there and we gather data that informs us. Concept signaling boosted performance on the signaled concepts, yes, but it did not have any effect on the non-signaled content, all the surrounding material that was not signaled. So it's not a shortcut for reading the chapter or the material in its entirety, but it is helpful, and our evidence bears this out. It is helpful in learning key points if we help to signal them to our students as to what is important for them to learn. Hope I got to the crux of your question. Thank you.
Interesting. Going back to your presentation at APA this summer, when you were awarded the Brewer Award, you focused on the 4 E's of effective learning: engaging student interest, encoding important information, elaborating meaning, and evaluating progress. And you spoke a little bit about utilizing technology in the classroom as part of this process. And so as we've navigated through the pandemic, or are navigating through the pandemic, I should say, and have had to rely on technology even more, how has the way you approach teaching changed, if at all? And what observations do you have to share about that?
Well, thank you. Yeah, I use this heuristic model, the 4 E's of effective learning, as a pedagogical framework. Because I think it distills the essentials of the learning process, the 4 key steps. I also happen to think that for me, we all know the magic 7 plus or minus 2, that I'm one of those folks on the -2 end of that gradient. And so I can only keep in mind maybe 3 or 4 things at the same time. But I do try to remind myself of those 4 key steps whenever I enter a classroom or sit down to write a textbook, helping to engage student interest, because without focused attention, the best we can expect is some incidental learning. And then helping them encode the key points that we want to get across to them. But we know that new learning is a very fragile thing. It can go in one ear and out the other. So we need to help them elaborate on the meaning of that material to strengthen and reinforce this new learning. And then we need to provide them an opportunity to evaluate their progress, whether they're getting it and how they're doing in the course. I don't think they should wait until mid-semester or later to know how they're doing. So let me offer a few specifics along those lines, and then talk a little bit about technology. I think as a classroom instructor, we need to grab students' attention from the get-go, from the moment we enter the classroom. And we need to focus on using attention grabbers that will help to engage their interest and hold that interest maybe for a few precious moments that we can then begin to get them to think about the material that we want them to learn. How do we do that? How do we engage their interest right from the get-go? And I think that this is something that I think experienced teachers will recognize. Using personal vignettes, using case examples, using class videos, using demonstrations, something that actually reaches out to the student and pulls them in right at the get-go. But then we need to draw their attention to important concepts so that they separate the meat or the wheat from the chaff, using bullet points, previewing what you're going to be talking about. And then we need to reinforce new learning. How do we do that? How do we get them not just to hear about and begin to maybe to make sense of concepts we're trying to get across, but to work with those concepts in order to strengthen them and make them more enduring. And I think it's very important to be thinking about tying these concepts, whatever concepts we're trying to get across, to examples. So we need to always be thinking concept, example, linking up concepts with examples as a way of elaborating on their meaning. We could also elaborate meaning in other ways through demonstrations of the concepts that get the students to work with the material. As for example, if we have time, we'll get to this later. One of the concepts, I love puzzles. Mm-hmm. And I use a lot of puzzles in my writing and in the classroom. I think the brain loves a puzzle. Mm-hmm. One of the puzzles I pose to students is, why is it impossible to tickle yourself? A question probably none of them has ever thought about, but it's an intriguing question, and actually was a scientific mystery until brain imaging studies revealed actually the neurological basis. We'll get to that later. But in wanting to introduce how the different parts of the brain work together, I would use that as a working example. We'll come back to that if we have time. But as to technology, I think we need to use technology smartly in ways that don't just entertain, but bring the concepts we are teaching to life. And yes, we can use video clips, and I certainly use a lot of them, but we want the students to understand the psychological concepts that these snapshots of life illustrate. We don't want students to walk out of class thinking that they watched a few cute videos, right? So we can use guiding questions to help them look at these video clips from a psychological perspective. As for example, I think we all have our favorite clips. One that I use regularly is from a Spike Lee movie called Crooklyn back in the mid-1990s. And I use this clip to illustrate differences in parenting styles between the mother and the father in an African-American family sitting down to dinner in Brooklyn, New York. And now they're going to look at that clip not just as a piece of entertainment, but as illustrating something very basic in how parents differ in how they parent their children. Another way I use technology is to administer all my exams and quizzes online. I've been a late convert to the online use of administration of exams, but I'm very happy in making the shift. I think it provides more rapid feedback to students. It also allows me as the instructor to do an item analysis on my exams. I do item analysis on every exam. I think they're all good questions. I wouldn't have put them on the exam if I didn't think it was a good question, but the proof is in the proverbial pudding. I want to see that item analysis. I want to throw out questions that just did not work, statistically speaking.
Well, now, interesting that you mentioned testing and sort of self-evaluation, that sort of thing. I was really interested if you could say a bit about your Minute Mastery quiz and the research that you have developed from that.
Yeah, thank you for that. The Minute Mastery quiz is a signaling technique that directs students' attention to an important concept. The most feared word, I would argue, the most feared words in our students' lexicon are pop quiz.
No.
Right? If you're in school or you haven't, even if you've not been in school for quite a while, I think that those words pop quiz will still send shivers up your spine. Mm-hmm. A mastery quiz is a pop quiz, but I promise you it's one your students are going to like. First of all, I believe in incentivizing learning. And a mastery quiz, we'll see, I'll explain in a moment, provides 3 incentives. It incentivizes attendance because you have to be in it to win it. It incentivizes punctuality, and it incentivizes attention. 3 critical elements to the learning process. Let me explain. A mastery quiz differs from a typical pop quiz because the students see the question at the very start of class, but they're not tested until the end of class. And they know that that question relates to something that I will be talking about in class that very day. So even if they didn't know the answer walking in, if they are in class, because you've got to be in it to win it, you've got to be on time to see that question. Pops up on their, we use Canvas on their Canvas page. And they have to pay attention because they don't know when during class I'm going to be talking about that very concept. And they are incentivized because they get they're awarded a certain fractional point for getting the right answer. And I tell them they can put that point in their hip pocket when they walk out of class. That's theirs to keep. And it seemed intuitively appealing to me as a way of focusing attention on key concepts in a way that students would like. And they do. I'll go into class. I just did this the other day. Walk into class. Hey, you know what day today is? I look at Mastery Quiz Day. Yeah, because they know they can earn a reward if they just paying attention during class. Anyway, we did a study again because I kind of hope to practice what I preach. I want to test out things before I actually say, okay, let's all go with this. We took 80 introductory psychology students. We randomized them to 2 conditions. One in, I'm sorry, let me take that back step, confusing one with the other. The mastery quiz, we actually found that using the mastery quiz in class, that students perform better on questions that were relating to the content that was signaled in the mastery quiz on their course exams than on non-signaled material. So it was having a payoff. It helped them to grasp the key concepts, or at least the key concept, one key concept I wanted to get across in that class. So mastery quizzes are a helpful signaling device. And it goes to the second D of effective learning. It goes to what it is important to focus on. Sorry, but Doug, you're cut out. I can't hear you. Nope. Or maybe it's me.
Not you, Jeff. I can't hear Doug either.
Oh, dear.
There you are.
Oh, there you
You're
are.
back. You're back.
Oh, I see. I'm just getting a message saying that I'm a little, I'm not unstable, but my connection is. So let me speak up and hope that
Well,
we get through that.
I would say as a clinical psychologist, let me be the judge of that.
What I was starting to say was that you've had a very, very long, very distinguished career and have had the opportunity to teach and mentor several generations throughout some very, very large societal and technological shifts in recent history. Looking back on your career, what stands out to you the most about what has changed and what has stayed the same with learning in each generation?
Thank you. Yes, important question. You know, I've given a number of talks on teaching millennial students, the digital natives, as we call them.
Yeah.
And now we need to extend that to the Gen X's and the Gen Z's, in which digitization has exploded even more. You know, it may be a rude awakening to us as instructors that students may not want to sit in a classroom and listen to us lecture for 50 or 60 straight minutes. So we need to adapt our methods to the needs of today's students. But let's understand the human brain itself has not changed in the past 30 or 40 years. Evolution does not work that quickly. But the way that people are using their brains has changed. Information these days is packaged in smaller digestible modules or chunks of information. And we need to be thinking about how do we can chunk our information in ways that can capture maintain student interest for those precious few moments to convey what we want to get them to learn. One thing that we could think about as instructors is what many people refer to as the rule of 8 or the rule of 10, sometimes the rule of 12, that we should mix things up in the classroom so that every 8 minutes or 10 minutes or 12 minutes, we change what we're doing. We go from maybe a lecture style to using a video, then to using a demonstration, then to using maybe a vignette. And we mix this up so that we can best capture and hold on to student attention.
Mm-hmm.
We also need to work on engaging students in the classroom. You know, like many of the thousands of instructors who were dragged, maybe kicking and screaming from the classroom in March 2020, when we all went remote. And I can't count myself amongst them.
No, me too.
We found that we were suddenly teaching as we are interacting here remotely through Zoom or another of these platforms. And we see our students in those little boxes. We can only see a small sample of our students in those little boxes. And hopefully, believe me, you know, sometimes you have to go out of your way to make sure that students are dressed before they actually log in. But we know that we're entering their bedrooms. There are many of them taking class from their own beds. And how can we hold their attention, especially when there's so many distractions, the cell phone, running to the refrigerator and whatever else. Yeah. I was teaching, as many were, online synchronous classes. I decided to use this as a challenge to do some research to see if there would be some learning benefits to building in some engagement activity. So let me explain. And this comes from some of the most recent research that we've done. What we did What we did is what I did was to introduce several different types of engagement activities in my online classes. A spot attendance check, right? In which all the student had to do at random intervals was to use the chat function to type here or present. So they knew that they were there and focused on the class at that moment in time. Mastery quizzes, which I've explained, which is that they were given a question at the beginning of class, and they knew that at some point during class, they would be learning, hopefully, the answer to that question. And then they were tested at the end of class. And I did a minute writing assignment as an engagement activity, had them write about something, a concept discussed during class at the very end of class in order to try to capture that attention. And then there were classes that did not include any engagement activity at all. Those were control classes. And being hopefully a good student of Campbell, I randomized the sequence of those engagement activities using what's called an alternating treatments design. So one class might be a mastery quiz class, the next class randomly determined would be a attendance check class, and so on and so forth. And then I compared their performance on material that they learned during those particular classes that were key to those engagement activities. And then we looked to see, whether or not there was any educational benefit. And in fact, we found interesting results. We found, I wonder if you could kind of post your own prediction here. Which of those engagement activities was most strongly connected to learning the material that was taught during that particular class? Would it be A, attendance checks, B, mastery quizzing, C, minute writing assignments, or none of the above? I won't put you on the spot, but my bets was on something that was a more active learning exercise, like mastery quizzing, right? Or minute writing, yes. Turned out the strongest predictor was attendance checks.
Wow.
Which had no content associated with them. But again, that's why we do research, isn't it? We don't do things based on our hunches. We do things based on what the evidence teaches us.
Right.
And I think there's good reason for that, because they never knew when that attendance check was coming. So that really kept them on their toes. And they were really keyed into class. Right.
Interesting.
Now, another thing that I do using technology is a lot of online surveys. I use, as many use, a program, a website called polleverywhere.com. You might be familiar with Poll Everywhere. It's a free service. It's an instant survey that students can respond to using their cell phones, texting their responses.
Oh yeah, I've heard of this. Yeah.
In fact, I'll say to them something they probably have not heard from any other instructor. And this goes to kind of using technology in other ways. I'll say to them, okay, class, pull out your cell phones. Pull out your cell phones. Don't hide them away. Let's use them for an educational benefit. And so I would post questions on this website, and they would respond true or false or yes or no. And we get a sense of the room as to what they believe or what their baseline level of knowledge might be on a particular subject. As for example, just the other day, I was teaching about health psychology. And I asked them to respond yes or no to the statement, COVID-19 has become the nation's leading killer. All right. Obviously, this is a terrible, terrible, terrible disease, and it's had devastating effects, as we all know. And so some of them said yes, some of them said no, but it got them to be thinking about, well, is COVID, as terrible as it is, the nation's leading killer? And the fact is it isn't. It's now, if you look it up, number 3 after heart disease and cancer. But we don't hear about heart disease or cancer on the newscast, or at least not through the pandemic. We certainly didn't hear about it. But it raises their awareness about it. So it's using technology this way, and I think in a different way that engages their interest. Thank you.
We on the committee for the Brewer Award noticed that in your nomination, there were a number of recommendations from former students and research assistants, as well as from colleagues. And one of the most common refrains that we saw over and over in these letters was your dedication to mentoring and supporting the next generation of psychologists and teachers of psychology. And now I assume that all of us who are involved in psychology education have a strong interest in making a significant impact on the next generation. I wonder if you could speak, excuse me, a little bit to the evident dedication that you have to investing in and mentoring your students throughout their careers.
Such an important question, Doug. Thank you.
Mhm.
You know, thinking back, we may not remember much of what we learned in graduate school, but I think we do remember our mentors and how much they influenced us in our careers and influence us still. You know, I mentioned my personal example of Donald Campbell.
Mhm.
You know, I remember back in the day that I was at Northwestern, I was housed in the smallest cubicle in the department. It was really a closet. It was a utility closet, basically.
Mhm.
But it was a closet directly across the hall from Campbell's office. And to me, that was treasured space. It was wholly a sacred space to me. And over the years, I've been involved in training hundreds of doctoral level students in clinical psychology. And I hope to have instilled in them a love of learning, an appreciation of research, and the importance of service.
Mhm.
You know, we need to reach out to engage our students in our research. I have very few sole authorships on the articles that and manuscripts I've prepared. Virtually all of my research studies include graduate students who have worked in my lab, which helps them get a foothold in the careers that they're pursuing. We also have undergraduates who have worked and continue to work in our labs. And we also seek opportunities for our undergrads. If you're not running your own research lab, there are probably research labs in hospitals and medical centers in your community that you could plug undergraduate students into. This is a wonderful career relevant experience for them and also helps them to develop more of an identification with the profession. So many things that we can do, and I think it's so important for us to be thinking beyond the classroom.
You have stated that your teaching philosophy rests on two basic principles. Number one, make it interesting, and number two, make it relevant. Going back to you're asking your students to take out your cell phones, you know, we reflect on this technological world that we're living in. Attention spans seem to be shortening over time, and relevance is actually, you know, a relative term. How do you put this philosophy of yours about making things interesting and relevant, how do you put that into practice?
Yes, thank you. Excellent question. You know, if it's not interesting, your students will nod off. So our first task, the first E in the 4 E's of effective learning, is to engage attention. But they'll also tune us out if they don't think the material is relevant, right? We may get excited about the principles of conditioning, but students want to know why it matters. Why do they have to learn about it? What does psychology have to offer people in their daily lives? Now, I like to say that if classical conditioning only helped us to better understand salivation in dogs, it would deserve no more than a footnote in the history of psychology. But that's incumbent on us to show how it is relevant. You know, when I teach about conditioning, when I write about conditioning, I don't begin with Pavlov and his dogs. I begin by making a statement to my class or my students that I hate eggs. I hate eggs. I hate the sight of them. I hate the smell of them. I especially hate the taste of them. And the runnier they are, the more I despise them. I have a taste aversion to eggs.
Huh.
Now, I wasn't born that way. My mom told me that I very happily ate my eggs as a youngster. So somewhere along the path, lost to the recesses of memory, I developed an aversion to eggs. I can't explain I wouldn't be able to identify the root causes. Although I suspect it had to do with my grandfather was a crusty old gent who kind of forced runny eggs on us as children, but maybe not. But in any event, all these many years, I've had an aversion to eggs, right? A form of behavior that was learned, it was not wired into me. And I use this example and then ask, what might the discoveries made by a Russian physiologist at the turn of the 20th century help us to better understand how someone can develop an aversion to eggs, what's called a conditioned taste aversion, and whether, and then I asked the students if they would be willing to share their own experiences with taste aversions. And by the way, you ask a question like, you're going to get hands will go up. And they'll tell you about all kinds of things, the shellfish, that they got sickened over and so on and so forth. But they'll tell you about all different kinds of foods you never think would lead to a taste aversion. But in that way, I get them to be thinking about how it's relevant, how the principles of learning, in this case conditioning, are relevant to our experiences. If I may, I'll give you another example, one that I use in class. There was a fellow who was addicted to heroin addict, living here in Queens where I teach, and he and his life had hit rock bottom, as low as you can get. As you could imagine, you could certainly imagine, what his life was like when heroin took over his life. Well, he was able to get himself into a rehab program, a 21-day drying out program at a local hospital. And he emerged from the hospital free of heroin. His body at least was cleansed of. But then he gets a job. He was a construction worker, gets a job at a construction site in Lower Manhattan and had to take the subway there from Queens to Lower Manhattan. And on the very first, true story, very first day of work, the subway doors open at a particular station in Queens. And he is overwhelmed with the most intense cravings for heroin that he could ever remember. And so intense that he quickly goes back to using the drug again and finds himself once again falling into that abyss. And I turn to the class and I'll ask, right, what possible connection could there be between subway doors on the subway car opening at a particular stop and having intense cravings for a drug like heroin? And a few of them will come up with the answer. They say, well, yeah, is that maybe where he scored his drugs when he was using? Yeah, in fact, that very station was where he would meet up with his dealer. Wow. Now we could understand how conditioning can be used as the cues associated with that particular, the stimulus cues associated with that particular subway stop, how that conditioned response elicited these conditioned cravings that proved his undoing. Fortunately, he got back into rehab and so on. But in this way, we could help our students to see how this stuff matters.
I can understand that completely. I was hanging on every word. I mean, starting with the egg trauma and then going forward to this is great real life examples of how you activate your teaching philosophy. So thank you.
Well, if I could underscore that for just a moment.
Okay, sure.
I think storytelling is such an important pedagogical tool. With all the advanced technology we have, and as valuable as that might be, right? Telling these stories, you say, Doug, that engaged your interest, and it engages your students' interest. There are certain magical words we can use in the classroom, and perhaps foremost among them is to say to the class, let me tell you a story. I got more to tell you if we had time, but let's go on.
I have every confidence you do, but unfortunately we don't have unlimited time. I really, really, on behalf of all of us, appreciate your insights. But before we turn to the questions from our attendees, Is there anything that we haven't covered that you'd like to share?
Well, a personal aside,
Mhm.
if I may.
Please.
I've been fortunate enough to do many things in this profession. Teach, do research. I maintain a private practice. I do consulting, write textbooks.
Mm.
But if you were to wake me up in the middle of the night and pinch me, pinch me and wake me up in the middle of the night, and when I came to my senses, and you were to ask me, what do you do for a living? I would say, I'm a teacher. That is embedded in my, it's such a, it's such the most personal ways to my very nature, to my soul, in fact. So I'm so absolutely beside myself to be honored with this award.
I cannot help but think how my friend and mentor, Charles Brewer, after whom the award is named, would have been so touched and pleased by that answer.
Thank you.
That was beautiful. Anyway, let me turn now to some questions from our attendees. If we may, okay. Our first question is as follows. I will read the text verbatim. Following up on the question about learning in the classroom changing over time, do you have any thoughts on how rising levels of student anxiety might be impacting learning?
Oh, absolutely. It's a very good question. There's so much pressure on students these days. There always has been pressure. I think even more intense pressure these days. And with the pandemic, we see the tremendous rise of both depression and anxiety in young adults today. And I see it, how fragile so many of my students are. And so it's such an excellent question. I would say that we have to make the effort to be available to our students, not as a counselor or even as a friend, but to be supportive of what they're going through, to try to work with them. And if you have a student that I had a student just the other day that is experiencing a very difficult time on campus, and she said that she's going home. She wants permission to take the classes virtually, although it's an in vivo class. And although it may not, she doesn't have a letter of accommodations from the Office of Disability. I said, absolutely. If that's going to help you get through this, if I can do that for you, absolutely. So I think we have to find ways. Also, I think by using tools that are mastery based, like mastery quizzing, that don't raise the level of anxiety like a pop quiz does. But another thing that I like to do to ease the level of anxiety, I think many of us do this, is to prepare a study sheet, all right, for each exam. And the study sheet, it's not just general principles or concepts, it's mapped directly to questions asked on the exam. So question 1, and there's a study sheet, a learning objective, and so on and so forth. So I want them to have to deal with that uncertainty that they're experiencing, what's on that exam. So I want them to be able to prep in a way that will best help them to prepare with as little anxiety as possible.
Thank you. Another question is as follows. I'm curious if you have any thoughts on grade inflation. Do you feel that there are expectations of higher grades now versus in the past? And if so, how does that interact with teaching pedagogy?
Yeah, again, excellent question. And I think it's a question many of us struggle with. I certainly, I recall there was a time when there was a concept of a gentleman's C. I think now we've come to a point that if a student gets anything less than an A, then somehow you have to justify it and defend your grade.
Mm.
So things have kind of been reversed in a way in terms of expectations. I will lay out my grading criteria to students as to what constitutes an A or a B and so on. And it's based on a point total, 100 point total. And they know where they are, how many points they're earning toward that point total. I tell them that we're in it together, that I'm here to help them succeed, that I'm going to help them provide the tools that I believe that they will need to succeed, but they have to meet me halfway. But I'm of belief that they have to earn it. That it's not a matter of just de facto giving out grades so that you'll be liked or get favorable reviews, which I think is an issue.
Yes.
But it's also I view the learning process as I view the psychotherapy process as a kind of collaboration. It's you're working with students, you're collaborating with them to help them, and together working on helping them succeed in the classroom.
Thank you. Well, that was our final question from whoa, no, it wasn't. We just got another question in. If you got time for one more.
Sure.
Does emphasis on student evaluations harm the quality of teaching?
You mean students evaluating the teachers, or is that what we're asking about here?
The question doesn't specify. That's a good clarification. Emphasis on student evaluations.
I assume that
students' evaluations of teachers.
Of teachers. Okay, that's what I thought. Okay, right. Yeah, right. We live in an environment in which we're constantly being judged and evaluated. We get, you have a call with the service provider from Verizon, and immediately you're going to hit with a survey rating her performance, or his.
Yeah, exactly.
It's part of what's happened in our society. And it creates this environment in which we feel we're constantly being judged and evaluated. It can lead us to subvert what we're trying to do, to just want to be liked rather than to be effective. I don't know that I have an answer for that. I think it's embedded within the general culture, and it kind of it diffuses into education for sure. I think there need to be protections for instructors, in which decisions of promotion and tenure are not simply based or largely based on student evaluations. So I think there need to be peers who are in the classroom. They're the faculty peers who observe what they do, and that has to be an important criterion, because I think it can lead us to playing just for evaluation, playing for good ratings rather than trying to help our students succeed.
Right.
That's a very good question. That's something that we're going to have to struggle to deal with. Well, if we have 2 more minutes, unless you have another question, I can answer that question that I posed earlier. You might already probably have forgotten it with all the other stuff we've mentioned, but why it's impossible to tickle yourself.
Oh, yes. Go.
Yes, right.
Go back to that.
So it's to set the stage here. Again, I'm teaching about brain structures. I'm writing about brain structures. And I just don't want to go into the amygdala does this and the pons does this, and we go into that, et cetera, one after the other. But I do a demonstration with them. I have them try to tickle themselves. I turn around, so I'm not feeling that they're being observed. I turn around, my back to the class. I have them try to tickle themselves, do the best they can to try, and then I'll ask them, how did that go? And none of them are able to tickle. It's impossible to tickle yourself, right? And then I ask them to imagine, what if somebody would approach you ever so closely, right? Where's my hand? There's my hand somewhere. And would you then have a ticklish? Yes, I would have that kind of response. So how is it different than when you touch yourself, tickling yourself, that is, you don't get a response. But when somebody else tickles you in the same exact way, so the same source of stimulation, okay, is channeled through the thalamus in the brain to the somatosensory cortex that reads body sensations. So the cortex is getting the signal that you're being touched, but there's a difference. And it was only through brain imaging that they discovered this. The difference is that when we tickle ourselves, we're also moving our fingers or arms. And to do that, to coordinate those movements requires that those movements be regulated by the cerebellum, that large cauliflower-like structure in the brainstem, the cerebellum. So the cerebellum has to coordinate those movements. When the cerebellum gets engaged, it sends essentially a blocking signal, get this, a blocking signal to the somatosensory cortex, and it says, hey, guy, you don't have to respond. It's only me. It's safe. It's only me. And we don't respond. But if something from the outside was to tickle you in the same way, then there's no blocking signal. The cerebellum doesn't get engaged. So now we could see how brain structures work together, right? To solve a mystery like, why is it impossible to tickle yourself?
Wow. Interesting. Well, I wish we had more time to talk about interesting stuff like that, but we are at the end of our session. And Jeff, I just want to thank you again for such an engaging conversation and a glimpse into this unique and very, very important area of psychology. And again, congratulations on your well-deserved Brewer Award for Excellence in Teaching Psychology. And I also want to thank our attendees for joining us today. We will be offering these fireside chats monthly through February of 2023, and details on registering for the upcoming webinars will be included in the follow-up on this evening when the recording is available. We also invite you to share the recording and information for future fireside chats with anyone you think may be interested in joining. We at APF wish you and your loved ones safety and health as we continue into the final portion of the new year. Jeff, thanks again, and thanks to all of you.
And thanks to all of you.